Hi, I'm Jeffrey Wernick, and here with Bruce Fein. Welcome to another Fein Points. Bruce, I think a good topic for today is really the concept of federalism and the relationships between the state and the federal government. And I think the perfect example is what's going on in California now. Um, I read that the last time uh, a, uh, a president sent the National Guard in without an invitation was in 1965, and that actually was to protect the protesters. So, not to arrest the protesters. I'd like to make some prefatory comments and then turn it over to you. Uh, One is, I find it very ironic that you have this administration that says no one's above the law, and that they're outraged at how the police are treated. Um, and I'm kind of confused because there was a very violent mob on January 6th, 2021. Uh, they went in while Congress was about to certify the presidential election. They broke down barriers. They violently entered the Capitol. Some of them said they were there to attempt to assassinate members of Congress. The whole Congress fled in fear. I always have one image I remember being shown on the news was one first when he was walking to the Senate was Josh Hawley fist pumping the crowd, and then they show another segment of him sprinting for his life in the building after it was invaded. Now, I'm trying to understand the difference between when you can beat cops, kill cops, spit on them, and and be called a hero and a patriot and be loved by Trump, uh, and then another group of people who so far have not inflicted anywhere near the type of damage to the police force as they did on January 6th. Yet they are in insurrection and rebellion. Okay, so I don't know if they've taken over any government building. I don't know if they've prevented the government from operating. So here you have a group of people that actually shut down the government for over 4 hours while Congress was um, certifying a presidential election. It seems to me the government is perfectly functioning. People might not like the way it's functioning, but it's functioning. In Los Angeles and California, there doesn't seem to be any existential threat to the government. Yet this is supposed to be met with real strong suppression, oppression, whatever term people think adjective might think is appropriate, where there's even the threat of bringing the Marines in. And yet on January 6th, where apparently all those people who were hitting cops, I think a lot. So I was just reading that so far about 13 police have been injured so far in LA, and none serious injuries so far. And we had a lot of serious injuries of the police on January 6th, and we had a president that did absolutely nothing but watch it, for a number of hours, in spite of all the appeals for him to take action to actually do something. And when he did something, he called the people patriots and heroes. And coming into office, one of the first things he did was pardoning.
Care about assaulting police or the rule of law. If he thinks he obtains a political advantage, then he does. I think, Jeffrey, want to put this in a larger context, and that is more frightening. The total, complete destruction of language to communicate ideas and to establish norms of behavior. The Trump administration simply doesn't use language like you would find in a dictionary. And they have no embarrassment about saying something on day one is the opposite on day two. And as a companion to what you just described over the weekend, remember the recent decision of the Trump administration to return Abrego Garcia to the United States. They've charged him with a crime, but they'll have to prove evidence of that. This is after week after week after week. The administration said there is no way that we can ever get Abrego Garcia out of this El Salvador dungeon. Really? And then suddenly it happens by magic. So we're dealing again, and again, we remember that he was deported under the Alien Enemies Act, which was predicated on the absurd idea that we are now being subject to a military invasion by Venezuela, a proposition that nobody in the United States believes. Even Mr. Trump doesn't believe that. But he wanted to do something to appeal to his constituents, so he invokes the Alien Enemies Act, because then he can deport people without any due process, which would require him to show there was a legal basis for the deportation. And so what we find over the weekend is the same destruction, if you will, of use of language, where you have an immigration problem. It was under control in California by the Governor Newsom. He's not being asked to send in Marines or National Guard or anything else. There is no effort to overthrow the government, the peaceful transfer of power that was true on January 6th that you described. It doesn't mean that there weren't law violations. Law violations happen every day around the country. There's murder, there's robbery, whatever. That's not viewed as an invasion or a rebellion. And now we have, again, the language totally being twisted. I'm told there's already a lawsuit challenging what Trump has done. And I believe that maybe it's a good thing that the credibility of the Trump administration is now so discredited with this idea of invasion or rebellion in the Abrego Garcia case that they're going to lose, in my judgment. That this is simply taking routinely fleas and magnifying them into elephants and saying, my gosh, we have a crisis, we have to do something. And I do think that this is a political calculation, right or wrong, by Mr. Trump, that it doesn't matter to him whether he's acting lawlessly. His mega crowd will still support him because it looks like he's trying to do something on the proposition that he got a mandate in 2024, forgetting the fact that no president can have a mandate to violate the Constitution. No president can flout his oath of office to preserve and defend the Constitution of the United States. But this goes into the situation of pervasive constitutional illiteracy. So many members of the citizens don't even know, the drastic encroachment on constitutional rights that's underway.
I think, when people say this was what Trump said he was going to do, and so this was his mandate. One is, we mentioned this before, he doesn't have a mandate. He won an election. He didn't get 50% of the vote. Okay, his margin of victory in the popular vote was the second smallest margin of victory this century. So that's not much of a mandate. His electoral victory, while reasonably substantial, in material in nature, since Ronald Reagan was elected president, more presidents have won by bigger margins than he did, than have won by smaller margins. So it's not like he won this tremendous electoral victory, nor did he certainly didn't win a tremendous popular victory in popular vote, and he didn't get 50% of the vote. So he won the election, but no mandate. Okay, when he did campaign, he campaigned on going after, as he described, millions and millions and millions and millions and more millions of criminals, drug dealers, rapists, mentally disturbed people. That's what he said. That basically was the illegal immigrant population, was all basically a criminal population. And so now where are they going to find these people? They're going to the places of work. So for people who have worked, they're going for people who have been here. Many of them have been here a long period of time and have become, members of a community. Likely, if they're working, they're probably paying taxes. They're going to schools to take kids out of schools. They're going to churches to rip people out of churches. And they're going to courts and places where people are going not because they violated a law, but because they're attending they're attending the court appearances they have to attend to because they're going through the process of formalizing their immigration status. So they're actually going to their hearings so they can legalize their status in the country. So these are people showing up. These are not the people who are not showing up, who are going underground. These are the people who are showing up and showing up to work, showing up to the process because they want to become legalized in the process. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that they have broken the law, but you would like to think that we're a country where the penalty is commensurate with the crime, and if the crime is 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they crossed the border improperly, and meanwhile they've not committed any real felonies since they've been here. They've not caused damage to a third party. They pay taxes. They've raised a family here. Okay, I'm not saying they should get off scot-free, but to take somebody who's established roots in the country, who live in whole communities, that you begin to rip apart these communities of people who represent no threat to our national security. Okay, so they did break the law, and we should separate out the people who represent real violent criminals who do represent a threat to people, to the community, as opposed to represent no threat to the community, who committed a crime of crossing the border inappropriately. And they could find these people, let them stay in the country. If they've done no damage and they've been productive human beings, why would we want to do this? And apparently many members who are legal in communities are protesting against ICE. I don't know how many people are joining ICE, and saying, gee, you know what? Finally, you showed up to get rid of all these people. You got a lot more people going in who are citizens, who are supporting the people being deported, and they're not supporting ICE. So what do you go? You have the federal government going into jurisdictions where the people support the illegals living there, who they view as harmless and productive members of the community, and you have the federal government ripping it out, and you're getting the people in the community upset. Who's the beneficiary of all of this?
Well, it's just, Jeffrey, it's just a political. If I could intercede here, the fact is that in the criminal justice system as well, Jeffrey, there's something called prosecutorial discretion. There are numerous, it happens every day. Prosecutor will say, okay, maybe it was a crime, was innocent, nobody complains, say, listen, we're not going to waste time on that. So they may not even pay a fine. They just say, no, this is not a worthy case because it doesn't rise to the level of seriousness that should invoke, the criminal justice system. I say it happens every single day. It's no different than in how it should operate in the immigration case as well. Okay, and you maybe had omitted, Jeffrey, that the majority of those who are here without authorization overstayed their visas. They didn't enter illegally. Right. They didn't commit a crime. It's not a crime to overstay your visa. But putting that aside, all the time we make decisions in law enforcement. Well, is the cure worse than the disease? They're paying taxes. Indeed, our Social Security system would be more dire if we didn't have these immigrants here paying into the system and getting nothing at the end of the rainbow, so to speak. They don't get the benefits. It's a very, very, I don't want to suggest at all, and I know you aren't, hey, we should just be indifferent to the law. Now, part of the problem we really have is that instead of changing the laws to make legal immigration far easier, so you don't have to wait 10, 15 years, the Congress, because they view this as a wedge issue, they do nothing. I think the last time anything seriously done was during President Reagan, 1986, which is like 40 years ago, But then that, no party, the Democrats, Republicans have any interest in doing anything about it. And then the executive branch then says, well, we'll just work on our own because Congress has a logjam. In some sense, the problem is a symptom of our, political pathology here, that people aren't really serious about doing things that help the country. They just are looking for the partisan political advantage here, instead of looking at how is a way that we can attract people. And I just give one example of what the hysteria produces. And that was in the McCarthy era, the early 1950s. We had deported a Chinese immigrant who had worked on the Manhattan Project. just because, well, it was China, who lost China syndrome. It was kind of crazy at that time. Chiang Kai-shek was in Taiwan. So he got removed from the mainland by Mao Zedong, and we deported him. He ended up being the godfather of the Chinese nuclear program. Think of how stupid that was, it's like deporting, Edward Teller or somebody like that, or Enrico Fermi. Come on, he's the one who we're Alamogordo. But that's the kind, and we just should use our brains to recognize that. By and large, it takes a good degree of a risk taking and moxie to come and leave a country and pick up stakes where you may not even know the language of your country you're going to at the time. So it's disproportionately, you're going to get strong, ambitious people who come through immigration. Why would you want to have them at the top of the ladder to deport? And you're absolutely right, Jeffrey. This is no effort here to identify the serious criminals and make sure that they're at the top they're the front of the queue of the deportations. They just indiscriminately go into every place. And as you point out, they go into the places where people have regular employment, that they know showing up every day, and that's why they have a job. Those are the least likely people to have any criminal records. But they're just doing it by numbers because they think that'll satisfy, the mega crowd when it comes to election time.
So it seems to me the provocation is on the part of ICE and DHS. Because one of the articles I've read, if it's true, is the fact that recently when they were going to the Home Depots and things like that, that they were just indiscriminately picking people up. So what out in the streets? What authority does ICE? Can ICE just walk up to any individual and say, if they're in out in public and say, show me evidence that you're here illegally? What rights does ICE have in stopping people?
No, well, ICE is not shielded from the Fourth Amendment. There has to be some kind of probable cause, to believe that somebody's doing something illegal. Could be a crime or otherwise. Now, there are certain exceptions, near the border where the Supreme Court has held you don't have to have the probable cause standard, just reasonable suspicion. But we're talking about raids that are way distant from the border, so that exception wouldn't apply. But ICE doesn't have authority to just walk around, pick up anybody and say, show me your citizenship. I think I had a dream that, you may be here illegally, or you said something against Trump, or you're a pro-Palestinian, therefore I want to arrest you. Now, unfortunately, you ask, well, what's the damage? If they do make an illegal arrest under federal law, it's quite difficult to get a damage remedy. How serious was it? So unless you have real oversight and command control at the outset, a lot of the constitutional violations go without any remedy.
So they can break the law with impunity and immunity.
I mean, as de facto, yeah.
De facto, yes, that's what I'm talking about.
Yes.
So while they're telling everybody that this is about a respect for the law, they have no respect for the law.
Yes, that's right. I mean,
they're lawless.
Yeah. Okay. So you remember the recent incident with the mayor up in New Jersey, where they first charged him and then they ran away from it because he didn't have any evidence, no probable cause. That's an instance where he has enough resources that he is suing ICE. He's suing DHS because he says they had no probable cause to arrest me whatsoever. But few people have that kind of resources and standing to survive, which is probably going to be a tough lawsuit.
And when they go to immigration court, do the judges ask them, what are the conditions under which they were picked up? Was there a warrant? Was there a subpoena? Or did somebody just grab them and haul them into I don't know what the process is right now, since supposedly the courts have stopped them of just grabbing them, bringing them to the airport and sending them to Libya or Sudan or El Salvador, or any place else, since they're supposed to not be doing that. Who knows if they're still doing it or not?
The answer, Jeffrey, is in the 1980s, the Supreme Court held that the exclusionary rule, that you preclude the admission of evidence that was seized unconstitutionally, does not apply just because deportation is viewed as a civil proceeding, and they refused to apply the exclusionary rule there. So you're left with a damage remedy or nothing. And I say the damage remedy is very, very difficult to pursue. You have to show it was made in bad faith and that kind of thing.
Well,
So,
I guess they could discourage it, the courts, by just not giving deportation orders to anybody that was picked up, that is not a violent criminal, and picked up in an indiscriminate fashion. So
yeah.
I guess the judges could basically discourage that type of behavior by every time they bring somebody to immigration court that that they say, I want to deport this person, they're here illegally, and the judge asks, well, what was the circumstances in which you detained this person? And if they detain them in an inappropriate fashion, they might not be able to punish the people who are lawless, but at least they can say that, you know, your lawless behavior has canceled out the lawless behavior of the other person crossing the border, and maybe your lawless behavior is even worse than theirs.
No, but Jeffrey, that's not, the Supreme Court said the opposite. Unfortunately, they said, since it's a civil proceeding, even if you do something unlawfully, the government's illegality does not cancel out the immigrants. I don't think it makes any sense. It's like the wrongdoer goes free because the constable blundered. That's kind of the idea. It's not just a blunder; it's a law violation. But anyway, that's what the law is. So there's very little incentive to.
This is encouraging. That ruling seems perverse to me from the perspective of, supposedly the Constitution is put in place to protect the people against the government.
Correct.
So if the government commits a crime against me, okay, the government gets, someone else gets to suffer the consequences, while the government suffers no other consequences. That just encourages lawless behavior on the part of the government. So I don't understand why a judge in the Supreme Court would think that the founders' idea of our form of government was to let the politicians be a criminal class, and they will have immunity in being a criminal class. And not only that, they'll be rewarded for. I mean, because this is the perversion. It's not a matter of them just getting immunity for something bad. They're getting rewarded for their bad behavior. They're accomplishing what they want to accomplish by breaking the law.
Yeah, but listen, Jeffrey, you basically took the words out of Justice Louis Brandeis' mouth in an opinion called Olmsted versus United States in 1928. He said, the government is the potent and omnipresent teacher. It teaches by example. If the government becomes a lawbreaker, it invites every man to be a law unto himself. It invites anarchy. And that's why he opposed this idea that, hey, the government gets to break the law. Unfortunately, it was written in dissent, but and Louis Brandeis, of course, was perhaps the most profound and brilliant justice ever to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court. And you got it exactly right, Jeffrey. Then that's what he understood as well. It is really perverse, because the idea I have is that the courts ought to hold the government to a higher level of legality than the private citizen. Remember, everybody who's serving in government, including me when I was there, we took an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. That doesn't happen to citizens. They don't take an oath. Everybody who serves government takes an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. There ought to be more draconian consequences when the government violates the law than a citizen. And yet, the law follows power, and the government has the power. So that's not what the law is at present, much to my regret.
Well, what can a mayor or governor do of a jurisdiction they're responsible for? Well, maybe it seems like they can do nothing when the federal government comes in and breaks the law in a jurisdiction they're responsible for. Can they hold? I guess because of the supremacy of the federal government in certain issues, that means that they cannot. I mean, you have Holman threatening to arrest Newsom, okay, and is there any basis under which Newsom can arrest anyone from ICE or Department of Homeland Security for breaking the law? In that jurisdiction.
Well, we have the one example up in New Jersey. We do have an outstanding lawsuit of the mayor who was illegally arrested, and they charged him, and then they dropped the charge. Now he's suing, of course, in his individual capacity.
Right.
He was detained as an individual. Now, when it comes to the situation, the larger point that you were making, can state authorities, prosecute federal authorities for violating the Constitution? I mean, the general answer is no. In fact, the most famous case occurred in California. It's called In Re Nagel, if anybody wants to read it. Anyway, it had this fact pattern. There was a very controversial U.S. Supreme Court justice named Stephen Field, and at that time, from California. And at that time, justices sat on circuit as well as in the Supreme Court, and he was traveling out in California. And he was being escorted by a Secret Service agent to protect him. And at one of the train stops, someone came to try to shoot or assassinate Stephen Field, and the agent shot in self-defense to protect the justice. And California sought to prosecute the federal agent because Stephen Field wasn't popular in California at the time. And the Supreme Court said no, that if you have an accused who is performing a federal function, the states cannot then prosecute. Only the federal government can, because otherwise states could frustrate the federal supremacy. So, but here I think we have a little different wrinkle, because Governor Newsom is challenging Trump's dispatch of the National Guard based on a wrongful invocation of a federal statute. And because the general rule under federal law, under the Posse Comitatus Act passed by Congress in 1878, is the military doesn't get to do law enforcement. But there can be exceptions that Congress can create. And the exception that Congress created in this instance was in cases of rebellion or invasion. Then you could have the National Guard summoned to try to suppress the rebellion or evasion, where there is a total inability to enforce the law. What comes to mind, for example, Jeffrey, during the Civil War, where you can't enforce the law in the seceding states. And so I think that the governor rightfully has standing to claim, we have standing because you're disturbing California. We have a concrete injury you're suffering, and under federal law, what you've done is totally and completely illegal. It's very similar to the successful arguments have been made against Mr. Trump's argument that under the Alien Enemies Act, we are now being invaded militarily by Venezuela. And I think the likelihood that Governor Newsom will succeed is very high. But all that happened, the result there comes is you would just have an injunction against the National Guard there. You don't end up actually imposing any kind of punishment against the federal officials. They just are told you have to stop doing it.
So again, no real adverse consequence. The encourage, a legal system should discourage bad behavior, not encourage bad behavior. I mean, these judges are supposed to be smart. Don't they give any consideration to the externalities they created by the judgments, that they make, and the potential abuses? And wasn't the abuse the founders were most concerned about was the abuse of executive power, and concentrated power? So that seems to be one of the things that was one of the main concerns when they developed the system of checks and balances, was to prevent this, not to, but I want to reiterate, this is encouraging it, okay? The judgments that are made by the courts is encouraging mischief, okay? It's not neutral on mischief. It's encouraging mischief because there's no downside associated with this, only upside. Yeah. So if I'm told, here's a scenario, here's the law, but while I'm breaking the law, all these wonderful things happen that I want to accomplish on a lawless basis, and then and I can do it until I'm stopped, and that's all that people can do is just stop it. So meanwhile, I'm going to play it out for as long as I can until somebody stops me, because there's no downside for me doing it. There's only upside. So when you create a scenario when there's no downside and only upside, you're clearly encouraging that type of behavior. So I
call it, Jeffrey, crime without punishment. Crime without punishment. Well, that really isn't a crime. What is rhetorically? And that's what we have here. And it's really, and it goes back even to a larger sense, Jeffrey. This whole idea of the general principle enshrined in our law of government immunity. You can't sue the federal government unless they consent to being sued. Said, really? I mean, you should be able to sue the government. They actually represent you. And if the government is doing something lawless, you should be the first responder that says, no, you can't do that. But now you can imagine how ridiculous that whole concept is. You can't sue the government unless it consents. It's like, well, you can't prosecute a criminal unless the criminal consents to the prosecution. What's going to happen to that? Of course, the government's going to consent in very, very rare cases, and all sorts of restrictions on when and how you can sue the government. And again, I think this is a perversion of what the framers understood. What the greatest danger to liberty is the government, because it has a monopoly of violence and money. And that's where you have to have the strictest safeguards. And yet the weakest safeguards are against the abuse of governmental power. But it goes back, and I keep repeating, it's because ultimately, I've been in the legal business for a long time. Legal doctrines reflect power, not justice. Power, not justice. And when power goes to the government, of course, they're going to end up with the doctrines that protect the government and not you.
Yeah, because this is not a product of a negotiation where both parties are mutually consenting to the terms and conditions of this agreement. So I certainly didn't agree to the terms and conditions of the government can be lawless with respect to me, and the only thing I can do is to prevent them, if at a significant express to myself, to stop breaking the law against me. But that's all I can do, is spend a lot of money to prevent them from to continue to break the law against me. But until I'm willing to spend a lot of money to stop them from breaking the law against me, they can continue to break the law against me as much as they want, and nobody will suffer any consequence on their end. So again, no downside. So you're subsidizing that type of behavior. It's why aren't more people, and they're talking about this, in the press and media? Why is it? There should be more information about this type of conversation you are having, because hopefully you get people who want to sit back and listen to this and say, this makes no common sense whatsoever. No common sense that we want to have any parties to have a relationship where the party that has the most power is given the most ability to abuse a unique power that they're conveyed with, and they can again abuse that power with immunity and impunity. And after spending, you can stop them from continuing to be lawless, but they'll never pay the consequences associated with it. So they profit from it as long as, and you have to spend money to protect yourself and to stop them from profiting off their lawless behavior. So the only damage being caused to them is that after you spend enough time and money, that they can no longer profit off being lawless. So that's the only downside for them, is the inability to continue on an ongoing basis. Why? I mean, this is what we're focusing on. If I was a mainstream media and what people were watching our conversation, is just how insane that is. How can any reasonable person think that this is a reasonable structure?
Yeah, Jeffrey, let me give a specific example. The Supreme Court, it backed away, but at one time it had the doctrine that if the federal government violated your constitutional rights, you would have a private damage action. You get damages for the violation, including Fourth Amendment violation. But it could be Fifth Amendment violations, arbitrary racism violations based upon gender discrimination, whatever. But then the court, again, a part of it is as the empire grew, it embraced this doctrine. No, that's wrong. That unless Congress gives you a specific damage action, the government can flout the Constitution with impunity. No damages. All you can get is an injunction, as you point out. In the future, don't do it again. Of course, well, what happens then? Well, suppose they do it again. Then you go get an injunction again. You can try to hold them.
I can't even recover the costs associated with getting. Think how perverse is that? The government does something illegally against me or any other person, any other individual or entity. You might have to spend millions of dollars, $10,000, $1, or millions of dollars to get an injunction against having the government stop committing a crime against you, being lawless against you. And when you've proven that the government has been lawless against you, you can't even recover the costs associated with defending yourself against the illegal act that they've taken that's been deemed illegal. You don't even get a remedy of getting your own money back of the damages forget about indirect damages. You don't even get the direct damages forget about compensating for the time that you had to allocate to this and other costs you might have associated with it that are collateral costs. You don't even get your out-of-pocket expenses reimbursed on this.
No, you absorb your own.
You're just thinking about the fact that this should be a fair outcome.
Yeah, well, it's the fact, Jeffrey, we got a governing class that creates the rules of the game that help the governors, and the people who are governed get screwed is basically what it is.
And you think this is what James Madison had in mind?
No way. And that's why these doctrines that we're talking about are Johnny-come-latelys, so to speak. There aren't doctrines that the early Supreme Court ever would have embraced, in my judgment. And again, it goes back in part, I believe that the doctrines are embraced because if you decide that your major goal and ambition is power, not liberty and justice, then who cares about the violations? Because you have to have the right to assassinate. I mean, as one example, Henry Kissinger, once when he was Secretary of State, he told then President Ford it was humiliation to have any limits on the president's ability to assassinate anybody. Can you imagine? This is not the Borgia Popes or Julius Caesar. This is Henry Kissinger, the celebrated statesman. And that's what he said. Well, how humiliating. The president can't assassinate anybody he wants. But these are the things that come when you decide as a country, your real glory is not liberty and justice, but just being powerful like Rome and like the British at the peak of its empire and things of that sort. And then the doctrines kind of migrate over to ratify that power structure. And we're only going to get it back. People say, I don't want to be. We don't want empire. We want liberty and justice. We wish everybody well abroad, but we're going to fight only to defend our own. That has to be the libretto, of our culture, if we're going to return any kind of sanity to the legal system. Because right now you're pointing out how insane this is. The government commits crimes against you, and all you can get is an injunction after paying $1 million, to go to the Supreme Court to say this is unconstitutional. But that's where we are as a culture. And that's why I think Holmes said, Justice Oliver, the life of the law has not been logic. It's experience and power. That's where you see the changes. And certainly not based upon reason or justice. And unfortunately, that's where we are at present. And it's really quite alarming.
I wonder if Pete Hegseth and Cristian were during January 6th saying, gee, we really need to get the Marines in now, take care of these people. They're insurrectionists. And I mean, they fought the whole concept that the January 6th were insurrectionists and engaged in a rebellion. Yeah. So apparently any group can go into DC and try and, enter the Capitol and topple Congress. And that's not but you have a smaller crowd. Unfortunately, some are engaged in violence, and some are and many apparently are peaceful. So demonstrated who was just outraged about what basically is lawless behavior on part of the government. Okay, yeah. But the government can get away with a lawless behavior. So what right of expression does an individual feel that they have when the government engages in lawless behavior? What's a legitimate way of protesting when the government is engaging in lawless behavior? Because if they're picking people up indiscriminately, just going down the street and saying, okay, you look like you're an illegal, so I'm going to grab you, or you're at a place here where, you're looking for a job or whatever, so I could assume you're illegal, and I'm just grabbing you and figuring out the rest later after I grab you, and the law doesn't really want me to do that, but until I'm stopped, I can keep doing it. That's they know, they have to know these are not stupid people. Okay, so they have to know they're inciting people, and I believe that's one of their objectives, is in order to get more public support for it is to provoke and incite people, and hopefully when they can show scenes of violence, then they can have their excessive displays of force, and hopefully they'll get public support for their excessive displays of support, because the people, there will be less sympathy for the people they're rounding up. So, I'm assuming that's part of their calculus, and part of the drama and theater they want to create is they want to have these scenes of violence show up. They want to provoke and incite this violence, and then use it as a way of then justifying this tremendous amount of force, and that the force then they hope for their part will be as a deterrent, so they don't care about being lawless. As long as the lawless behavior produces the outcome they hope their lawless behavior produces.
Yeah,
But
and I would add, Jeffrey, I
that's
want to go
very
back.
first to me.
It's a January 6th, because Mr. Trump, for 90 minutes, I mean more, I think 183 hours, he saw invasion and rebellion against the United States Constitution about how you have peaceful transfer of presidential power. It was on TV. He could see it. He was watching it. There was an opportunity to invoke the statute that he did in California. If there was ever an example of rebellion, that was it. Trying to use force and violence to prevent the counting of state-certified electoral votes for the transfer of presidential power. He did nothing. It was actually Mike Pence was the one who actually called for the forces to come in that ultimately suppressed the rebellion. It wasn't President Trump. So why is it that, according to Mr. Trump, January 6th was not rebellion and California is? It shows you the complete manipulation of ideas and whatever. But to go back to
but out of the rebellion, those people were heroes.
Yeah, and got pardoned. Yeah.
Yes,
Right.
heroes and patriots that got pardoned. They didn't get threatened. They didn't say the law would come down on them, and and they would receive the type of treatment of persecution and crucifixion or whatever they're going to do to these people. It's here they were hostages. They were not prisoners. They were not criminals. They were hostages. The criminals were the prison guards. Were the people holding them hostage. It's really I don't know how anybody cannot see the irony. Really, I mean, I want to appeal to people who, look, if you're a MAGA person because you want to put America first and you believe in these trade wars and you believe that that immigrants are hurting the country, and have your beliefs, whatever your ideology, have your beliefs, but please don't support lawlessness. Okay, don't support because you like the ideology of the president that excuse lawless behavior. This is
Jeffrey. It goes back to a very simple principle: the ends don't justify the means. You go through due process. If you think the law is too weak, you can amend the law. But the ends don't justify the means. That's the end of the rule of law. You're back to the law of the jungle. Well, it's a noble end. I do whatever I want: kill, rape, steal, or anything else. These are procedural things that I believe that require at least a minimal level of education in order to understand how important they are. And our whole educational system is totally decayed and broken. They don't teach anything that you need to know in order to be a self-governing people, that in order to protect these institutions of due process, separation of powers, this is the way you do things. No matter how noble your goal is, you still have to stay within the procedures of the law. I mean, that's just so. And we are seeing the results of this complete breakdown in our educational system. I say right now, parents ought to be protesting what's not in the libraries, not what's in them. What's not in the libraries: the Declaration of Independence, Gettysburg Address, the Constitution of the United States, the amendments, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, all those things that give you the civic understandings that enable you to be a good citizen. A good citizen meaning that you comply with the process by which you seek to advance your goals and efforts. And that's what I see as a complete disaster.
Now,
in the United States
when the president does something like this, any president, would this be something normally a president would review with his Office of Legal Counsel, since you were in the Office of Legal Counsel?
Yes, I worked on executive orders like this. The Office of Legal Counsel now is basically non-functional. Everything is done right out of the White House. And the Office of Legal Counsel, I remember we went over to the White House and said, you can't do these things. It's unconstitutional. And the White House accepted that. But now there isn't any institutional restraint whatsoever. Unfortunately, I believe Attorney General Bondi, Mr. Trump says, jump, and she says, how high? There's no check on that score whatsoever. And that's why, I mean, imagine how she must feel. She sent numerous lawyers out in the field to say, there's no way we can get Abrego Garcia back from El Salvador. We've done everything we've tried. It can't be done. And then the next day, then it's done. I mean, you look at how embarrassing that is, you know. Your credibility just looks like a fool, right?
And I think the person who actually was the lawyer who worked on this Abrego Garcia case, after filing the charges against him that were presented by the administration, the lawyer quit. Then is what I read. Yeah. So I guess he did his dirt. I guess he finished it up because he thought if he didn't finish it up, then Abrego Garcia might never have gotten back. Yeah. And it seems pretty evident to me that they were keeping him there until they could come up with enough information to make charges against him, and they didn't want to bring him back and be embarrassed by bringing him back and not have anything to charge him with. So I think the time had nothing to do with their inability to bring him back. I think it had to do with the fact that at that point in time they couldn't bring any charges against him, so they didn't want to bring him back if they couldn't bring any charges against him, and they kept him there until they could make a case against him.
Well, they're also, I think they're exploiting, Jeffrey, the old.
If that's the case,
yeah.
If that's the case, it seems to me that given what the judges said, just because he's back doesn't mean they did not act in contempt of court.
No, they're going forward with contempt charges already. Yeah, because they know that they were lying to the court. They've basically proven that. And of course, Trump is immune himself. He's just throwing these people out. They're going to have to walk the plank. But
so they acted with contempt of court and contemptuousness towards the court and contemptuousness towards the law.
Yes, for sure. And all now, if they try to impose criminal contempt, you know, the President Trump could pardon them for criminal contempt, which is probably what he would do. Civil contempt, you know, you could impose a fine or something of that sort. But what we have is a situation with regard to Abrego Garcia. Is my view is what's likely to happen is that they will drop the charges after a month or so, because there's no evidence there. You're telling me all this time you had all this evidence and you sat on it. Remember, because Abrego Garcia was an issue in the first Trump administration. The immigration judge that put a hold on his deportation because he had reasonable fear of being tortured or persecuted in El Salvador was a Trump. This was a Trump decision not to file any appeal from that ruling.
Right.
And so now we're talking 6 years later, and now the evidence has emerged. But the government is or Trump, and politicians are skillful about, you know, the Mark Twain understanding that lie gets halfway around the world before truth gets its trousers on. And so they feel, well, okay, we'll drop it later on, but everyone will just remember, or most of them will remember, hey, we charged him with a crime. He was really a bad guy. And they forget that, hey, we dropped the case whatsoever. And that's pure use of government power and a platform to manipulate the people, just like tyrants and dictators do through propaganda.
So we probably have legal advice of basically telling the president, well, this is probably illegal. You can get away with it. These are the consequences. And he's probably, as a smart businessman, says, I love this. No downside. I break the law. There's no downside. Let's go for it. So, which is not an unreasonable thing to do. So it's an unreasonable thing that incentive exists.
Yeah.
But behavior is not unreasonable behavior. So it's disgusting behavior, but it's not unreasonable behavior. It's immoral, amoral, unethical, sleazeball, disgusting behavior, but it's reasonable behavior in the sense of, if you have something where you have only upside and no downside, you do it. So it's a perverse system. Now, if you were speaking to Newsom, what would you be advising Newsom now? What would you be telling Newsom to do?
Well, I would advise him to be doing what he is doing, that is suing in court to get an injunction requiring the removal and prevention in the future of Mr. Trump using the National Guard when they're not genuine cases of invasion or rebellion, not been requested by a governor. This is ordinary law enforcement. It happens regularly. And I think he's doing that already. That Mr. Trump was not authorized under Posse Comitatus and under this National Defense Authorization Act to do this, because He just totally manufactured this idea that we didn't have the situation under control. That's what I would do. I mean, otherwise, there's not a whole lot that Newsom can do. Again, it goes back, I think, Jeffrey, to all the horrors that come when you endow the president with limitless power. Which, again, I'm not blaming just on Trump, because this has been happening for 50 years or more. Is that there's so much discretion, and the government has so much money, largely because of the income tax amendment. Is even if Newsom prevails, we know what the result's going to be. Cut off all the contracts, cut off all the grants. They'll do everything to try to dry up money, California, and force it into budget deficits and things like that. So there can be huge retaliation. It can be clearly motivated by anger that Governor Newsom is exercising a constitutional right to ask for relief in court. That is, there's the First Amendment says you're entitled to seek redress of grievances against the government. So you'd figure, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this picture. You shouldn't be punished for exercising your right to seek redress of grievances, yet we've given the president so much power. That's exactly what can happen. It's more overt with Mr. Trump. But I would make this observation, Jeffrey, I would call myself a creature of Washington, D.C. Even though Trump does things that are more overtly retaliatory, don't worry. In earlier regimes, they would retaliate, but it would be you would know what's going to happen, but they would conceal it better. They wouldn't, go on Twitter or something and advertise it like on Times Square. But having been in Washington, absolutely, there's so much discretion. If you say anything that criticizes X, you're not going to get the contract. You're not going to get the meeting with this official that you wanted to meet with. You're not going to get this grant. If they look and see you wrote something in the press or did this or that they don't like. It was suppression, but it was a kind of like suppression light. But it existed. Anybody who has any sophistication knows how easy it is, given the vast discretion that the government has in exercising its powers, that you get on the wrong side of them politically, forget it. It's not going to, you're never, ever going to get anything, and you'll never know why, because the government never tells you why. A classic example is in the immigration area, where you can be denied a visa to enter. The government says, no, we're not going to tell you why. I said, why? How can I have any rights? You're saying I can't get a visa. I've had that happen several times. You're not going to say why? Nope, we can just do it on our own. That's just one example of the kind of discretion they have. And you didn't get a government grant. Why didn't you? Well, we're not telling you, go sue, and 10 years later, if you're still alive, you may get an answer. But this, again, is a consequence of the fact that we have a government that's 10 times too big. That's why we urgently need a shrinking of the government. It invites abuses that cannot be detected because they're all behind the scenes. Trump makes it a little bit easier to detect, but I can guarantee it. It happened under Biden. It happened under George W. It happened under Clinton, Mark Rich. It happens under all of them, ever since, the government got so huge and politics became such an important component of life, because it enters every nook and cranny of what you do, that the retaliation is just better disguised by other presidents. But to say it doesn't exist, ridiculous. It does exist.
Well, can Newsom go to a court and say, I don't want ICE here because I have a pattern of behavior that what they're doing is lawless? And so what can the court do? What can Newsom say? I'm the governor of the state. The federal government is coming in. They're acting lawlessly. They're acting lawlessly, not as the exception, but the rule. And so what happens if the federal government says, what can the court do to prevent ICE and DHS from behaving in a lawless fashion, if anything at all? And are you basically saying that really, even though the court could acknowledge that ICE and DHS's behavior is lawless, that essentially the governor can do nothing to protect the citizens of his state against lawless behavior on the part of the federal government? Because you can sit back and say, okay, ICE did all this behavior. They rounded up all these people. They're just rounding up people indiscriminately. The only thing you can do to punish them is stopping them from doing it. So what would be the aggressive strategy if you really want to go to courts and say, that really ICE is out of control, DHS is out of control. They're completely lawless, and I got to protect the people of my state from this lawless behavior, even if the actor committing this lawless behavior is the federal government.
Yeah, I think that the most promising approach, Jeffrey, is to seek an injunction, stating that ICE cannot, an injunction prohibiting ICE from violating the Fourth Amendment, which obviously you should figure that's already an obligation since they're subscribed to the Constitution. But the advantage, if you can get an injunction against that, that means that if you could then prove a violation going forward, you're not basing a remedy based on Fourth Amendment. You're saying you violated a court order. That's contempt.
Right.
Now, if it's criminal contempt, then you get the issue of a pardon. But it's civil contempt, you could impose some kind of fines on that score. The difficulty you have in terms of strategy is that it's not Newsom himself that's likely to be the victim of the illegality. He's stepping in the shoes of immigrants, right? And kind of as a third party trying to protect their rights. Now, sometimes that's permitted if the government acts what's called as parens patriae on behalf of all of its citizens to protect itself, because ICE can violate the Fourth Amendment rights of citizens too and say, well, sorry, we made a mistake. You can't sue us for damages. If we do it again, you maybe get an injunction if you wait a long enough time and have enough money. So there might be, he might be able to sue his parens patriae on behalf of all the citizens of California who want to stop this lawlessness going on. And if it was systematic, it's not isolated, just one. And maybe in discovery, you could get statements that we suspect exist, but we don't know for certain because they don't live in a fishbowl in the government, saying we don't care, violate the Fourth Amendment, do anything. I imagine those conversations have occurred. Sometimes they're smart enough not to put it on a piece of paper because they feel it could end up being gotten by the Freedom of Information Act. But that's probably, there are conversations of that sort, and that could convince a federal judge that this is systemic. It's not just individual ICE agent doing this and get an injunction. I think that's probably the most promising approach.
Yeah. Well, the evidence so far seems to me to be that this is pretty systemic and probably intentional, and there's probably been conversations about it. But you're right, there are probably conversations in a format that you'll never get a Freedom of Information discovery because there's probably no document that has reflected these conversations on it. And I guess maybe that's why I'd be curious to see litigation between, to have Holman send people to arrest Newsom and then see this litigated in the court and have then it would obligate the federal government to, in a court of law, defend the application of a law that they probably know they're abusing, and will try and abuse it for as long as they can. I tend to agree with you. From my reading of the law, I don't really think they'll win in the court. I mean, they probably win with Clarence Thomas and Gorsuch and Alito. So they probably got 3 guarantees and maybe 4. But this might be an issue that Roberts might go with the quote liberal justices.
I think yes, and I think Jeffrey, what emboldens maybe the court they need is that basically they went face to face with Trump over Abrego Garcia, and they saw Trump basically surrendered. He blinked. He took Garcia back. Right now, he tries to minimize it by saying, "Well, he's going to be charged with crime." But my guess is they're going to drop the case again, because in the Trump world, evidence doesn't matter. They have lived, I believe, in a fantasy land life so long. They've never actually had to prove anything to be true in a court where you actually have evidence and cross-examination. So the people who are drafting these, they have no idea what they're going to have to do when they get before a judge. Some of the judges call them toddlers, you're little babies here. But I think in that case, they found that Trump blinked. He didn't say, well, the heck with it, we're just not going to move forward. And that, I think, will make it more likely that the court will stand up in the future again to Trump.
Yes, but I think this is just. Meanwhile, my heart goes out to the people in LA. We do support law enforcement. If people are here, people should not engage in violent protests. People have no right to destroy somebody else's property, and the protests for protests to be effective, the best thing is to be peaceful. So violence is not only wrong, it's counterproductive. And so if we have anybody in California or any protesters watching it, on the one hand, I personally feel sympathy for, the injustice of just indiscriminately rounding up people. And I certainly don't think people who have established roots and have been law-abiding citizens since they came in to the country, not following the right procedures, I don't want to grant them, a free ride, but I don't want to disrupt their lives if they become productive members of society. It's my personal, beliefs. And frankly, I don't even like this being a national issue because pretty much the law stipulates that there should be almost no. It's easy for the Republicans in Congress to pass legislation, which right now basically illegal immigrants are not entitled to really any federal benefits. So if they're not entitled to any federal benefits, the only people paying for the cost of the illegal people are the jurisdictions they live in. And so why should people in New York or Michigan or Florida care if California wants to be a sanctuary state? If the costs of being a sanctuary state is borne by the people of California, why do people in another state care? So why should their opinion matter? If there's no consequence to them, why should their opinion matter?
Yeah.
Issues of real national security, those issues matter. But issues of a group of people coming here and the state or local municipality decides that they want to support the people, and the taxpayers keep voting for that people, and by voting for those people, they're supporting those policies. Why should anyone else care about it? Again,
Yeah.
absent someone being a violent criminal, and then we want the rule of law applied to anyone who is a criminal, whether they're legally or illegally.
Yeah. And also remember, with regard to if they're here illegally, they're still paying sales taxes. They're still paying property taxes or license taxes or whatever. And that's why it means some of the state governments, they profit off the fact that many are here illegally because they're paying taxes and they work. They generate income. So with regard in general to the issue of immigration, I go back. I just think that we need to have wholesale reexamination of how we permit immigrants with proper screening. We need to expand legal immigration.
Yes.
It's puzzling. I don't feel comfortable with just saying, well, we should just squint at the law. Then we should change the law if we're not going to enforce it. It isn't a good custom to just say we can pick and choose which laws we want to enforce and which laws we don't want to enforce. And I think what we're witnessing also out in California is that, and this is where I go back and add to what you said about how you protest. There is an area. It's called civil disobedience. There's Martin Luther King. You don't engage in violence. You think the law is wrong. Certainly, the laws against integration, if you will, the racially discriminatory laws. And you can do a Montgomery bus boycott. You can do sit downs. That was done oftentimes in the Vietnam War, but there wasn't any violence. And that's a way in which you can kind of express your opposition, even if you're violating the law, but you're not threatening anybody else's health and safety. Violence, in my view, is never acceptable unless you're being attacked, and you have to use it in self-defense. That's the downfall of civilization. We can't accept that.
Yeah, in my opinion, Miller and J.D. Vance and maybe Trump too would have called Rosa Parks a domestic terrorist.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the little kids, who got the cattle prods and the water hoses from Clark and Bull Connor. Yeah, they're the baby terrorists, right? Baby Hamas, because they had the audacity to want to vote without racial discrimination and be able to walk into a grocery store or a gas station and be a patron without being told that no, they couldn't drink out of the white water fountain or the white bathroom or something like that. I said, okay, no. But, Jeffrey, I want to underscore here, we're having this conversation, and it shows that in virtually all respects of life and law, everything is matters of degree. And the reason why we have brains is be able to utilize lines, matters of degree, that where we know, hey, this dividing line kind of makes sense. It's not Euclidean geometry to know exactly, but it makes sense in enough of the cases, like 500 out of 501, that you can use it as a rule of life. But we've just given up on this idea of balancing checks and balances and moderation. It's the Aristotelian mean, extreme one way or the other way. That's going to destroy us. That's not how real life is. I say real life is not prime colors. It's chiaroscuro. It's shades of gray. We got to deal with that, and just because they're not on your side doesn't mean they're the enemy. Okay, well, let's talk, and maybe we can find another dividing point. And that's why I go back to the complete decay of our educational system. It doesn't teach critical thinking and line drawing and when you're going too far. So it's just, it's like George W. after 9/11, you're either for us or against us. Wait a minute, no. There are a million. It's like you're either going to marry somebody or you're going to be their enemy. There's no intermediate, levels of relationship. There are a million intermediate levels of relationship. But that understanding comes with education and critical thinking, which now has kind of disappeared from our culture.
Yeah, I would write with the people who my friends who identify themselves as MAGA. I many of them I challenged after January 6th. I said, imagine this scenario. Imagine the scenario where where you had a role reversal, and Biden was challenging the outcome the way Trump and Biden had exactly the same evidence Trump had, to challenge the outcome of the election, and a group of, Biden supporters behaved the way they did and broke into the session while Trump was being certified. And I asked them, would you honestly tell me that you would describe them as heroes and patriots if the scene was exactly the same? Okay, you're witnessing the exact same thing, only reverse the roles. Are you telling me your reaction would be exactly this? You're telling me that Trump would be calling them heroes and patriots? Is that what you want to tell me? And when I try, people tell me I'm a tough negotiator, but I also like to think I'm a very fair negotiator. And and I have like a definition of fairness is if I could easily, whatever I'm saying, I could as easily listen to somebody telling me what I'm telling somebody else. So in other words, my position, so I don't say things because I'm on one side of the table, and that if I was on the other side of the table, I would think it's absurd. I only say things that I would think are not absurd if I'm the listener. So I don't really like arguments of convenience. I prefer conversations based upon principles. Not arguments. Of convenience, where my words are a function of what side of the table are in. No, my words are independent of whatever side of the table are. My words would be the same, exactly the same words, whether I'm this side of the table or the other side of the table. And to me, I think most reasonable people, that's how they would behave, is their words are not a function of which side of the table they're sitting on. The words are based upon some set of principles, so it doesn't really matter what side of the table they're on. And unfortunately, most of our conversations, people could say one thing one day, and when they're on another side of the table, they can renounce everything they said that other day, and will be saying something completely the opposite because that's what their benefit is at that moment in time. So their words are only circumstantial and context driven, rather than being about this unwavering principle that's independent of circumstances, time, place, geography. It's just the way you believe. And, and your words are timeless in that respect. They always have meaning.
Yeah, it's like one justice called that attitude that you've described, Jeffrey, as having ideas like restricted railroad tickets, good for this day and train only. But that's another day and train. Nope, new railroad ticket.
So what are the other things you think are important for us to talk about, Bruce, while we have this time together, besides the what's going on in California? What else do you think is important that you'd like to touch on today?
Well, we should be receiving in the next couple of weeks a flurry of decisions from the United States Supreme Court on the more important cases, but they usually hold them to the end. But I want to focus on, and it may seem a little bit arcane, an aspect of the U.S. Supreme Court that's really quite troubling to me. And that is what they call the shadow docket. The court now has regularly decided, based upon virtually no briefing, cases of staying lower court decisions mean they could be an error, which means keeps the status quo until the Supreme Court, maybe a year from now, gets to decide cases. And Jeffrey, politically, timing is everything, right? An issue that's very, very important now could be stale in 6 months. And so the political benefit is already, if you could get any, has already been achieved, whether you're right or wrong. And moreover, the cases that the Supreme Court has are usually quite challenging. They're not red light cases or auto crash cases. And it benefits from full briefing on the merits, argument, it's in the public, and deliberation. And it's deciding these very major issues with regard to DOJ, Freedom of Information Act, the Alien Enemies Act, shutting down whole departments on the basis of presidential decisions alone. On this, what shadow docket? Well, we'll just keep something on hold. Let me give you one example, Jeffrey. One related to recently the ability of DOJ to get in and look at our private information. And a lower court said, no, you can't do that. You haven't got this is arbitrary and capricious. You're not having the proper training and safeguards against disseminating private information. And the court jumped in just this last week and said, well, put a stay on that lower court ruling. What, stay? That means that DOJ goes in and they're looking at all our private information now. Really? And it could be a decision in a week, in a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year. And this is really unprecedented in the history of the court. Before, you would go 3, 4, 5 years before the court would stay a lower court order. Say, listen, if it's all that important, you can ask for expedited treatment, Jeffrey. I mean, I was there. The Pentagon Papers case was a case in the summer that was expedited treatment. The Nixon tapes case was an expedited case in the summer. The Rosenberg death penalty case was a case expedited. So if there's a need to move forward to come to a decision relatively quickly, the court has a way to do that. They don't need to issue stays. But even when they act quickly, they still have full briefing on the merits. They still hear both sides. They sit in all 9 members and they deliberate. And it's now they just seem to, hey, this is just a shortcut, to do and handle a lot more cases, because these orders, these stay orders, are typically one sentence, say we grant a stay and no reasoning. The dissent sometimes issues reasons. But I view this as a very, very dangerous effort here to bypass the full argument that you should expect in the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's done it over and over again for the government. And it doesn't do it for private parties. It goes back again. The government gets to have special government. You want more limits on what the government can do rather than less with regard to private citizens. And the court, by using the shadow docket, to decide the important issues, seems to me to creating a deterioration in the rule of law. Yes, the other thing I would just comment upon the issue about these nationwide injunctions by district courts, where the Republicans now are deploring it, but they supported it when Biden was issuing these executive orders regarding student loans. Again, who's ever benefits by it, they jump on one argument one way and the opposite argument the next day.
And they also did forum shopping. They were going to Texas.
Yeah.
And they did forum shopping all the time. So, and yes, they celebrated it.
Yeah.
And again, that's another issue. I contacted people I know in the MAGA world, and I said, can you show me one example where you opposed forum shopping?
Yeah.
When the during the Biden administration, when Republicans were going to Texas for national injunctions to, what was a friendly jurisdiction and winning injunctions, show me where one time where that not only did you were neutral on it, where you wouldn't celebrate what they were doing.
Yeah.
So you were celebrating when Republicans were doing it. Why don't you celebrate when Democrats are doing it? Now you claim to have a philosophical problem against it. You don't have a philosophical problem against it, But I think the same is true. I've spoken to people, that, recently, some of the people I know who have been lauding during this battle between Musk and Trump, who've been lauding, well, so sad to see it, can't thank Musk enough for what he's done for free speech, and all the statistics show is that there's more content moderation on X than there was content moderation on Twitter. So what has changed was who were the winners and losers of that content moderation. So it's not, so the people are happy. If people really were fighting against content moderation, they'd be against Musk, what he's doing. But no, the winners, in the past, the winners, now the losers are going to blue sky. So some of the liberals have left and gone to blue sky because they find, they found X a more hostile environment for them than they found, Twitter under Dorsey. So it's not as if the people who are winners really supporting free speech. No, they're supporting the fact is that they're now the preferred speakers, rather than them being, in the ones where the other ideology were the preferred speakers. Now they're the preferred speakers. So this is really not about them liking Musk because he supports free speech, which he might do on a personal basis, but as a platform, the platform doesn't support free speech. And when he just had that, that little war mini tiff with Laura Loomer over the argument over H-1B visas, and she got suspended and she got a blue check mark, and then after a period of time, I guess she got it back. But that was just, that's just a purely discretionary act because somebody said something that upset him, and there were repercussions associated with it, and some people got outraged and some people didn't care. But that's clearly not consistent with bringing free speech back. Here in BitChute, we have real free speech.
Yeah, and it exactly right, Jeffrey. And one of the things I think that I'm sure you agree with me. Listen, we want to encourage. If Jeffrey or I say something you think is wrong, you should speak out and say we think it's wrong. Don't use ad hominem attacks. That doesn't do anything. But you think the facts are wrong, your analysis is wrong. That's how you sharpen your mind. I don't want people to just stand up and salute and say, no, you think there's an error? I can sharpen my thinking. Free speech is a way in which you hone your wisdom, not trying to defend it like a castle or a fortress. No one's omniscient. Everybody can make errors there. There's nothing wrong with saying, well, I disagree with you. You don't have to use nasty words. You can say, I think you haven't done the proper analysis. Did you consider 1, 2, 3? That's entirely appropriate. And I appreciate that. I can't possibly anticipate even in a program with Jeffrey, maybe we stumble from time to time. It's not because we want to, but because you're human. Like Alexander Pope said, to err is human, to forgive is divine. And that's what we need to utilize free speech for. It's a common collective endeavor to acquire wisdom and understand benevolence. It's not a unilateral act, and that's by listening to all different viewpoints, then you come, well, this one I think shows that experience justifies 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No one's born with, epiphany and they know everything. Never. It's really true, like they say, and even in the physical sciences, trial and error. Trial and error is the way in which you become wiser. Okay, think that now. Now I think I didn't quite analyze it right. I correct it. I'm not embarrassed about making an error. I try to correct it and don't make it again. I may make another error. But that's the nature of being a human being, having the humility to know that you can make errors. I could be wrong. I keep repeating, that was the beginning of civilization when a human said, I could be wrong. I got to listen to other people. I have to have due process, I'm not omniscient. I only view things through my perspective. Other people are not me. They may see a different thing that I don't see. And that's what we have to have, this common commitment, so we can move forward as a community and in treasuring these very, very basic principles of life.
Yeah, conversation should be a discovery process. It should, all conversations should make us smarter.
Yeah.
So, and that is what productive conversation should do, is to make as you said, it either, if we have a good argument, people will say, respect it. And if we have a weak argument, people will call us in the weak argument, and that next time we'll have a better argument because we've become smart and we've learned something. And that's what we want to do, is we want to keep learning. So, I certainly, in our BitChute meetings, the ones that I participate in with the management team, everybody speaks up. Everybody's entitled their opinion, and when we try and reach a consensus on the issues that we address, and we put a lot of effort into in building a consensus where we try and do almost everything by unanimous consent. So sometimes you don't accomplish that in one meeting. It takes multiple meetings to do that, where either you've been convinced or you've convinced somebody else. And I think I think part of the problem with this, which is why also the founders did not really like democracy very much, and they understood and they had seen the failures of Athenian type of democracy, is the fact is that I asked people this question. I said, what happens if I own 51% of a business and you own 49%, and you and I end up disagreeing on almost everything, and then I basically am forcing you to agree, even though the difference between your ownership stake and mine is very tiny, that ultimately everything is done according to the way I want it, because I'm 51%, and I can pose that I could be 50.1% and you could be 49.9%, and that gives me control over the governance. And we start out friends, and then I start doing a whole bunch of things that you don't like, and you find that you have no recourse to anything that I'm doing. I said, nobody wants to be trapped in circumstances like that. So, which is why I like in the government companies I get involved in, I like there to be broad consensus, because I don't want anyone to ever feel trapped. I don't want anyone to feel as, we started off as friends, we're agreeing, then you got to figure out how you either form consent where everybody ends up reasonably happy, or then you got to figure out how to divorce without destroying the business. But you certainly don't want to keep somebody captive. You don't want to keep somebody hostage in a business, where they don't like. And that's kind of like how we have the governance in our country now, is we have hostage taking. That's why I think most governments should be local and not federal. And the federal government, when you federalize and centralize every decision, you're essentially hostage taking half the society. You can actually be hostage taking the majority of people. So because then you have all the people who don't vote, who don't speak up, but might be against the policies. Only they feel, for whatever reason, that their vote is irrelevant, that their voice is irrelevant, so they don't participate in the process where they think the vote and their voice is irrelevant, and therefore you can have tyranny of the minority, which is tyranny of the majority. But either way, they're states of tyranny. And I think this then goes back to, and again, if we had this issue of, we didn't have the issue of federal supremacy, then we wouldn't have this problem in California today. I don't remember. I think that's why Madison referred to the Constitution as a federation. So I mean, the issue of the U.S. really being called a nation and the Union, that was something that came later with the likes of people like Daniel Webster, and then the Civil War, where holding the nation together, became, a more important objective. But, in the beginning, I think it would have been very, very hard, going back, to convince the states to ratify the Constitution, that the states and the people were prepared to ratify a document that would have made state government pretty irrelevant.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, a couple of things have done that, Jeffrey. In addition to that, the income tax amendment and the direct election of senators, did that. That was the end game for the states. But Madison he styled this as dual sovereignty within their realm of jurisdiction. The states were supreme, and then you had the federal government was supreme. But Madison couldn't have believed, that the federal government would really do anything other than provide national defense. That's what it's about. In fact, one of the great incentives for coming to Philadelphia in 1787 to draft the new Constitution was that the foreign countries were picking off one state against another state under the Articles of Confederation, and creating the opportunity for internecine warfare, if you could, and said, wait, we can't do this. And we were at a great disadvantage of negotiating with France and Great Britain, because you had 13 different sovereigns all negotiating separately and having one played off against the other. But outside of national defense, that's why the government really didn't do anything, for years and years and years, other than enforce, the handful of federal laws against treason and mail theft or things of that sort. And I say, what broke down that dike was the fact that we decided, at least as early as flirting with manifest destiny, something that Trump referred to, by the 1940s, to go around first the continent, the world, that we're going to emancipate everybody from their evil, but only self-determination is reserved for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and and again, I attribute that to the breakdown of the educational system. No longer were we the educated, the powerful class educated. It was, okay, you had to drink apple cider or cider of some sort, have an Indian scalp, and being bored in a log cabin. Now, I don't have anything against, I have something against taking Indian scalp. You want to be born in a log cabin, that's fine. But that was kind of the earmark that you didn't need to know anything anymore. You weren't a Madison or a Jefferson or a John Quincy Adams or anyone who actually read and philosophically understood the importance of process or whatever. And the stupidity of manifest destiny, which, as you can imagine, it's a completely intellectually vacuous idea. Manifest to who? To you or to the opponent? It's not manifest to Mexico that we were going to invade them. It's maybe it's manifest to us. So it was a slow, process of accretion. And again, and I go back to what I call this paradox, Jeff. On the one hand, when we expanded the franchise, basically universal franchise, consistent with the declaration, government by the consent of the governed. If you're going to be governed, you ought to have at least an opportunity to vote.
Right.
But we simply, with expanding the franchise, it created an egalitarian intellectual culture that just doesn't understand anything more than personalities. They couldn't understand institutions anymore. So it was a breakdown, if you will, of our ability and the community's ability to understand the importance of sticking with process. We don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And then we got caught up in, hey, let's be the successor to the British Empire. Who wants to? I hate the British Empire. I never would. If I was around at the time, I don't want to be the British Empire. It's horrible. Let's just stick with what we have and influence abroad by example. But that's not what happened. What happened is ultimately the educational system broke down, and we decided, hey, let's be an empire. We have the economic strength, the military strength. Teddy Roosevelt sailing the Navy around the globe just to kind of strut on the stage. Then we're into Panama and Mexico, Nicaragua. Then soon we're going abroad, and everything else follows now. Afghanistan. We worry about the Solomon Islands and Fiji and whatever because China's building a road there. I say, you know what? I really don't care whether China builds a road. Solomon Islands. It may be bad for Solomon Islands, and they got to take care of that. But as long as we have invincible self-defense, I'm okay. We can encourage Solomon Islands to follow our example if they want, or China, but that's up to them. We're never going to make the world perfect. It's not our ability. We can't do that. All we can do is make it less. All we can do is make it less bad by example. And when we go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, we end up with Iraq, we end up with Afghanistan, we end up with Libya, destroy countries, leave, people die, and it's more miserable than we started out with, right? And even if our intentions are good, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I'm not maligning intentions. People do this for the right reason. We got to be smart enough to know what we can't accomplish. And that requires the maturity we need, adults in the living room. Right now, I don't see any of those adults.
And part of being an adult and having a rational process is whatever people think about, resources are limited. I know everybody thinks a free lunch exists and that the governments can spend an infinite amount of money, but almost nobody's asking the question, how much is it costing to implement these immigration policies?
Yeah.
So, and again, I don't want to reward people for illegal acts, but there has to be some sort of cost benefit analysis. So, I mean, the cost associated with removing, violent criminals, people who represent a threat to society. But if we're spending a lot of money removing people who are actually contributing to society, the question is how much money? Because everybody thinks it's for free. I can send all this out. I can do all these flights. I can send people to Sudan, send them to Louisiana, then fly them here, and then fly them there, and have a plane full of 10 or 15 people or 20 people, and do this every single day, rounding up all these people. Nobody's asking the question of the FBI and the people involved in this. What percentage of the resources? How are they allocating resources now to picking up immigrants who cause no damage to the country other than the fact they came in legally? And what other things are they not looking at now that they were looking at before, to focus on this? And how much dollars are they spending to do that? It seemed to me an informed public would sit back and say, I'm looking at the benefit of a policy versus its cost. Okay. You would think that would be the analysis that a rational person, a reasonable person should ask for. I mean, should want to know. If I'm going to take somebody who's never committed a crime other than walking across the border 20 years ago, they've established a family, they're paying taxes, they're supporting the community, how much money are we going to invest in removing them? How much money am I prepared to put up in incremental tax dollars? Because that's the real question. There shouldn't be this free lunch, people saying, I'm going to issue debt. How much more do I want to come out of pocket to pay to remove people who are contributing to society?
But Jeffrey, what you're neglecting is political math is not financial math, right? And the politicians making these decisions, and they got political math, right? That's the same reason why the stupidity of tariffs continues to prevail. Political math, they say, okay, the short-term benefits to the tariffs, they can see the voters right now in the ballot box. The people who pay for it, because the pain is spread so far, among 360 million, the jobs that aren't created, they don't see that as a downside at the ballot box. So they do political math and say, even this is insane when you do financial math, it still works for me politically. And that's why you can never trust a politician ever to get 1 + 1 = 2. It reminds me, I say, of there's a joke that oftentimes is told about a Lebanese child. He's asked by his teacher in 4th grade, what's 1 + 1? And he says, well, am I buying or am I selling? Right? He didn't want to give an answer. He knew whether it's on the buy or the sell side. But anyway, that's why the rationale that you've given simply doesn't work in the political domain, because political math doesn't work that way. That's why you have the government regularly doing literally insane financial things.
Yeah, I'm trying to go back to your point. If we had an informed public, an informed public should be asking. These are the questions an informed public should be asking. This
absolutely.
There are limited resources. How are you allocating the resources so they create the most valuable for us? Because everything has a cost, and we pretend nothing has a cost.
Yeah.
So that's a fallacy. It's phony. It's untrue. Everything has a cost. The question is who will bear that cost. So and I think people should bear the consequences of that's another thing. People sit back and say people should bear the consequences of their decisions. They cross the border, okay? Bear the consequence of your decision, okay? I'll tell the American public, you have 36 trillion dollars of debt. Pay up. Bear the consequences of your decision. You issued that debt, you pay it off. Bear the consequences. Okay, pay off your debt, pay off the 37 trillion dollars, and adequately fund your benefits. Okay, adequately fund your Medicare, adequately fund your Social Security. Yes, you want to tell people to bear the consequences of their decisions? You, the American people, you bear the consequences of your decision. Okay, balance the budget. Okay, pay for whatever the government wants you to do, and write bigger checks. Okay, for everything that you want to benefit from, okay, bear the consequences. Pay off the debt. Fund the 37 trillion deficit or whatever it is about that now, okay? Bear the consequences of your decision. Fund Social Security appropriately today. Fund Medicare adequately today. Bear the consequences of your decisions. Don't use this as weapons against somebody else because you want them to bear the consequences of their decisions when you don't want to bear the consequences of your decisions. These decisions are the choices you made. You voted for people who did this stuff because they want to please you, because you don't want to bear the consequences of your decision. You want a free lunch, but you want to have an exclusivity over a free lunch, and you don't want to share it with anyone, okay? Bear the consequences.
Yeah. I mean, it's in a little related faction. There's used to be a Senator, Russell Long, on the Finance Committee from Louisiana, and he had a jingle that he used anytime a tax bill came up, and he said, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that fellow behind the tree, right? So that you don't have to pay, the fellow behind the tree gets paid. You're talking to no. We shield ourselves, like the first and second estate in France before the French Revolution. That's the kind of people we're dealing with. But you're absolutely right. Jeffrey, in saying that ultimately, the American people got to get educated in this stuff. Don't fall for this phony stuff. And you have it in the ballot to just not return these people to office. You keep sending them back and you get the same old. And you have to, of course, part of the problem is you got to attract candidates, who would actually do the job that Congress is abdicating. And that's difficult to find these days, especially because people get graduated from the best schools. They're still constitutionally illiterate. And then we remember, Jeffrey, we had, who was the one who ran for Senate in Michigan? We had that luncheon with him. He was in the House before.
Justin Amash.
Yeah. Now, Justin is one, listen, he does speak on the merits. I don't agree with everything, but listen, this is a genuine mensch, He discussed things on the merits. He doesn't run away if he may get it wrong, but you can engage with him. He understands seriousness of ideas. But unfortunately, that he doesn't have zillions of dollars, and he doesn't win. But he would have been an ideal candidate, and we just don't elect those people anymore. I say it's a twofold problem. One, the incumbents have a lot of name recognition and money advantage, and number two, the American people seem to be largely indifferent to Congress now and its importance in the separation of powers. And they figure all that matters is the president anyway, so who cares? And they don't understand the fact that when you have a limitless president, it can hurt you every bit as much as it can help you, and it's come back and haunt you one day.
I want to ask you one more question before we go. I think I read that it's Mike Lee that is proposing a constitutional amendment that if the deficit goes above 3% of GDP, that they have to that everybody in Congress has to be replaced.
Yeah, they had an amendment. Yeah, remember, but listen, Thomas Jefferson. He understood it first time. He wanted to have an early amendment to constitutions prohibiting the federal government from borrowing a penny. He said, yes. No way, bankers are going to destroy us. And that's why if you can't borrow, you got to have in-go and out-go the same, or have surpluses. And he understood that, but unfortunately, and again, I think the ethos at the time, it is reflected in George Washington's farewell address, is that it was thought to be just morally and ethically wrong to saddle posterity with paying the debts incurred under your watch. And he excoriated, a country that would do that. But I don't think we got any ethical or moral guardrails anymore in politics. They do anything they want. Yeah.
Clearly not. What are your last words, Bruce?
No, my last words are we always appreciate anybody who comes on and engages and listens. And that's what makes us, I think, a team effort here. Whether we accomplish a whole lot or not, we know that our motives are pure, and we welcome everybody who wants to listen and engage on the merits of how difficult life is to be upright and move forward.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.